What's up, everyone? Here are my NFL Week 8 DraftKings picks. Hope all of you guys had a very profitable and successful Week 7. Be sure to check out my Week 7 lineup review video that I did on Monday. There'll be a link down in the description and a link in the top right now. So let's go ahead and take a look back at my Week 7 picks. So you can see, all in all, it wasn't a bad week at all. Had some very good picks that worked out really well for me. Had some bad picks as well, but it's going to happen on any week. So if you want to see some more in-depth analysis on these players, be sure to check out that lineup review video like I said. So let's go ahead and hop into this week's picks. All right, so moving into my first Week 8 stack, it's going to be Jameis Winston and Mike Evans, and this is a really, really obvious play this week. These two guys are going to be the most popular cash game stack, and with good reason. First off, they're both coming off really, really good games, and Jameis Winston's price actually went down. And you could argue that the matchup is even better for these two guys because they're facing the worst passing defense in the NFL right now in the Oakland Raiders. Now, I talk about it a lot because the Raiders are a really bad defense overall so far, but they have recently brought down that total, but they're still the only team in the NFL right now that is allowing over 300 passing yards per game. So it's definitely still a good matchup for Jameis Winston and Evans. Mike Evans has had 5 straight games of at least 11 targets. Obviously, Vincent Jackson is going to be done for a while now, so Mike Evans still has shown, even without Vincent Jackson, he can be effective, like we saw last week. So he doesn't need that big man opposite of him. Oakland has allowed the most receiving yards to opposing wide receivers in the NFL at just over 1,400 yards. So Jameis Winston, you have to play him in cash game. Like there's just no ifs, ands, or buts around it. Play Jameis Winston in cash games and find a way to build your lineup around him because he has a great matchup. He's so underpriced, and obviously Mike Evans is the top choice to pair him with. So these two are definitely going to be the most popular pair in cash games without a doubt. All right, so for my next stack, I have Aaron Rodgers and Ty Montgomery, and Ty Montgomery is such an interesting player. Like, he is really entertaining to watch because of everything he's doing on the field. Obviously, because of the running game that he's getting, or the running upside that he's getting, he's not getting a ton of carries, but he does have 14 rushes. He has 66 yards on 14 rushes. That's nearly a 5 yards per carry average, which is obviously pretty good. I heard James Starks had knee surgery, so he's expected to miss 4 weeks or so. The real thing that you need to keep an eye on is Knile Davis. Knile Davis has now had more time in this offense, obviously over the long week for them since their last game. The Packers' last game was played on Thursday night. So he's had a lot more time to get adjusted to the playbook and whatnot. So I don't expect Ty Montgomery to run the ball quite as much, if at all, maybe a handful of carries. But the real benefit you're getting from Montgomery is in the passing game, obviously. I mean, he's had 10 receptions in the last 2 games, which is just unbelievable. So I mean, obviously they're kind of using Ty Montgomery, even when they're throwing the ball to him, they're using that as their running game, if you will. I mean, they're throwing the ball like 4 or 5 yards downfield to him and just chucking away at it, trying to move the chains one at a time, and they're not trying to get those chunk plays like we're used to seeing. So I like Montgomery in this game. The Falcons are allowing over 25 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, which is 4th worst in the NFL. So if you don't have confidence in Aaron Rodgers, I understand that. A lot of people are starting to think that Aaron Rodgers is washed up. They think that he's overrated. He's not the guy he once was. And all those things make sense, but all in all, I think it's a good matchup for him. But I can't blame you if you don't want to play Aaron Rodgers and you just want to play Montgomery. I think Montgomery is too cheap still, believe it or not. I mean, he's going to get so many touches. I mean, obviously he might not get quite as many touches because of Knile Davis, like I mentioned, but I like Aaron Rodgers a lot. Obviously, Montgomery gets a big boost as well because Desmond Trufant is probably going to be on Jordy Nelson. So maybe you could go with an Aaron Rodgers, Ty Montgomery, and Randall Cobb triple stack. I definitely have some interest in that. Devonta Adams obviously just went off in the last game against the Bears, but I don't know how much we can really read into that. So I think this is a good combo, but again, I can't blame you if you just want to go Montgomery in this particular situation. And I do think Montgomery is not a bad person to play in cash games. But ultimately, if I'm going to run this stack, it's going to be in a tournament. All right, so for the final stack, I have Russell Wilson and Jimmy Graham. And this is a really, really interesting game because a lot of different things are going on here. First off, I guess if you like to go with the narrative, it's a Jimmy Graham revenge game. It's a Jimmy Graham homecoming, whatever you want to say. He's going back to New Orleans for the first time. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. Also, Jimmy Graham has just been playing better recently. That said, Russell Wilson has been playing bad. And a lot of this can probably go to the fact that he's just not healthy. He's got problems with both legs, I think, ankles, knees, whatever. But he just doesn't have much running ability right now, and that's really, really hurting his overall game. That said, the Saints are terrible at defense. Like, I mean, there's just there's really no other way to put it. It doesn't matter where they play; they're bad on defense. And in the 3 New Orleans home games this season, they've allowed 35, 38, and 45 points in those 3 games. So they're allowing a ton of points at home. Obviously, that's partly due because the Saints score a ton of points at home. So this could be a high-scoring game. I think a lot of people are going to be hesitant to play any Saints in this game because of the Seahawks defense, and that's completely understandable. But I think this is obviously a really, really good situation to play these two guys. Russell Wilson, again, he's priced a little bit appropriately. I don't think he's a great deal by any means, but hopefully sometime soon we can see him get his legs back underneath him, because until then, he's going to be an okay play, but he really needs to have that rushing upside. So I like Jimmy Graham a lot in this game as well, not just because of the narrative, but just like I said, because he's been playing well. And the Saints have struggled against tight ends a little bit so far this season. So, I mean, Jimmy Graham's had 5 receptions and 8 targets in the last 4 games. Russell Wilson has been struggling, like I said. So maybe this is the perfect situation for these two guys to really, just go boom and have a great game. So I'm looking for that, and I think quite a few other people are as well. So don't expect these guys to be under-owned by any means. Okay, so moving into some running backs now. The first guy that I have down is David Johnson, and it pains me to talk about him since he's going up against my Carolina Panthers, but the dude is an absolute boss on the field. I mean, he has 15 DraftKings points in every single game this season. He's coming off 3 straight 100-yard rushing games. 2 of those came against the Jets and the Seahawks, who are both very, very good rushing defenses. So, the dude is matchup proof. Now, it's not another great matchup for him. He's going up against the Carolina Panthers, who are, what a lot of people like to say around the industry is a funnel defense, meaning that they're very good up front. They have good interior linemen. They have a very good linebacking core. Some even say it's the best in the NFL, but their edge rushers are obviously a big problem with this team, and obviously the big issue is the secondary. So I wouldn't be surprised to see David Johnson put up 50 rushing yards and have 100 receiving yards in this game or something along those lines. So I don't know if I'm gonna play David Johnson in a tournament just because of the price. And honestly, I'm not even sure if you have to force him into cash games. I mean, obviously, like I said, when you're putting David Johnson in your lineup, you're buying that floor. You're buying those guaranteed 15 to 20 points every single week. That said, there's just not a ton of value out there right now. Obviously, Devonta Booker could come into play depending on what happens with C.J. Anderson's knee. Right now, I'm not really sure what's going on with that. So Devonta Booker at $3,700 could be a good cash game option and could be a good way to kind of balance this out if you want to play David Johnson, or it could be a good way to just go cheap at running back and pay up at receiver again like we did last week. A lot of different ways you can build lineups each and every week, but David Johnson definitely has to be into consideration. Okay, so next up I have Jacquizz Rodgers, and this is a guy who has filled in for Charles Sims and Doug Martin perfectly for the Buccaneers. I mean, they couldn't have asked any more out of him. In his first 2 games with them, he has back-to-back 100-yard rushing games. He has back-to-back 20-point DraftKings weeks as well, and he's yet to score a touchdown. So if he can keep doing this damage that he's doing in all facets of the game, I mean, he didn't have that many receptions last week, but against the Panthers, he had 6 receptions, I believe. So if he can keep getting it done through the air and on the ground, if he can start getting in the end zone, then he's really going to have some huge weeks moving forward. So, I mean, he's got another good matchup against the Raiders. I talked about it earlier, how bad they are in defense. They've allowed a 3rd most rushing yards in the NFL. This is a guy who's going to get 25-plus touches in this game, and assuming it goes the way we expect. And, I mean, he's still not even $6,000. So, I mean, Jacquizz Rodgers is a guy you got to consider in cash games. You got to consider him everywhere because he's been a super safe player these first few weeks, and he's really showing why he needs to be on this team. All right, so finishing up the running backs here, we have Devonta Freeman, and He's going up against the Green Bay Packers, which actually is not an ideal matchup for running backs so far this season. They're only allowing 14.9 fantasy points to opposing running backs. That said, I mean, just take a listen to some of these running backs they faced so far this season. They faced T.J. Yeldon, they faced Adrian Peterson, they faced Dwayne Washington and Theo Riddick, they faced Bobby Rainey, they faced Kadeem Carey and Jordan Howard, and the last person is Ezekiel Elliott, and Ezekiel Elliott ran all over them. He ran for 150 plus yards. He had, 2 receptions or something like that. So if Tevin Coleman doesn't play Devonta Freeman. Just do it. I mean, the dude is averaging like 16 fantasy points per game right now, even with Tevin Coleman playing. And he's not even getting 100% of the carries. He's getting looks in the passing game. He's had over 5 targets, looks like 4 or 5 times so far this season. So Devonta Freeman is going to get a lot of the workload, and I like Devonta Freeman a lot, even if Tevin Coleman does play. But if Tevin Coleman doesn't play, which it doesn't look like he's going to be perfectly honest, because I heard that the Falcons training staff is going to be very, very cautious with him. So if he doesn't play, I'm playing Devonta Freeman 100% cash games. All right, moving over to some wideouts now. So I have Julio Jones down here first, and just like what I said about David Johnson earlier, Julio Jones is matchup proof. He's facing off against the Green Bay Packers, who, again, they're not a bad defense, but they have been missing Sam Shields, which I haven't heard yet if they're going to be missing him again or not. If they are, then obviously that's going to be a big bump for Julio. Even if he does play, Sam Shields has missed quite a few games, so he's going to be a little bit rusty, and it's not the best matchup, obviously, to come back off an injury and have to face Julio Jones. That said, I'm not sure if I'm going to have to force Julio into my lineup this week. I've already talked about it a little bit, and again, it was with David Johnson. There's not a ton of value out there, so it may be a week where you have to kind of find that middle tier balance at the wide receiver and really just kind of everywhere. If that's the case and we don't have any value pop up like a Devontae Booker or a whatever guy, a late injury or something, and we have a ton of value at a certain spot, then it may be a week where you don't need to play Julio. I'm not sure if you even need to play him, even if that doesn't arise, because there's a lot of good options this week in the middle tier. That said, if you can fit him in the lineup, do it, because it's Julio Jones. So Brandon Marshall is the next player that I want to talk about. And he was a guy that I liked a lot in tournaments last week, and obviously it didn't really work out. It was kind of a weird game. Geno Smith went down with an injury. Fitzpatrick came in. Fitzpatrick actually played quite a bit better than a lot of people expected when he came into that game, and that's one of the reasons I like Brandon Marshall in this spot. I think Ryan Fitzpatrick has something to prove now, even more so than usual. He's been benched. He knows what that feels like. Obviously, he's not going to get benched again now because it looks like Geno Smith is going to be out for a while. Brandon Marshall has a great matchup here. Looks like Joe Hayden's not going to play, but even if he does, I know a guy who's a really big Browns fan, and he said even if Joe Hayden does play, he struggles with big physical wide receivers like a Brandon Marshall. So, just a little bit of a heads up there. The Browns, it's the Browns. They've allowed 10 touchdowns to wide receivers this season, third most in the NFL. They've allowed 18 passing touchdowns, which is tied for first. They've allowed over 2,000 passing yards, which again is third most in the NFL. There's still no Eric Decker. They got to throw the ball to somebody, right? Obviously, I guess you could say they're going to run all over the Browns, which, is possible, obviously, with Forte and Bilal Powell. But I just think this is a perfect spot for Todd Bowles to say, you know what, let's go beat up on this team and run the score up and prove that we're not an absolute laughingstock and prove that we're not the worst team in the NFL, and just throw the ball to Brandon Marshall, 15 times, get him 3 receiving touchdowns. So we'll see. I'm slightly considering him in cash games, to be perfectly honest. I'm probably not going to bring myself to do it, but in tournaments, I like Brandon Marshall again this week, and I think he's a really good option. I think he could be somewhat popular because he's going up against the Cleveland Browns. Everybody's going to want to pick on that defense. That said, he may not be quite as popular as I'm expecting because he's a New York Jet. So I think Brandon Marshall is definitely a really good option this week, and I'm going to try to get as much of him as I can in tournaments. All right, so next up I have Demaryius Thomas, and this is 100% off of whether C.J. Anderson is going to play or not. Now, if C.J. Anderson does play, we hear he's going to be 100%. He's going to be 100% effective, and he's going to get all the snaps like he usually would. I'm not going to play Demaryius Thomas. I'm not going to play any Broncos wide receiver. That said, if we hear CJ Anderson can't play or is only going to play a quarter of the snaps or something like that, I'm heavily considering Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders. They're both projecting almost identically right now, but I have Demaryius Thomas up here because it's a hint cheaper. You can see that Thomas is projected at 16.1 points. Sanders is projected at 16.2 points as we speak. Obviously, that's subject to change, but pretty ridiculous how close they are in projections right now. So obviously, Devontae Booker is someone to consider as well. But again, we have to hear more about CJ Anderson. Still pretty early in the week. The Chargers are very, very vulnerable on the ground, but they're also vulnerable through the passing game, as we've seen. As I've talked about, Jason Verrett's obviously done for the season. Brandon Flowers didn't play last week. I'm not sure if he's going to play this week or not, but if he doesn't, that's obviously going to be a bump for Sanders and Thomas. So make sure you keep all of these things in mind when building lineups. All right, finishing up here with some tight ends and defense. First up, I have CJ Fedorowicz, and this is a really, really interesting guy. I mean, first off, this Texans tight end situation is really confusing. I mean, Fedorowicz is getting quite a few targets, but Ryan Griffin is stealing some of the targets, so it's kind of just all over the place. But again, this is another week where it's very similar to Vernon Davis last week, where he's probably not the best talent in the world. He's obviously not the best talent in the world, but it's a good matchup against this Detroit Lions defense. Fedorowicz has had 7 targets in each of the last 3 games. Lions are still the worst team against opposing tight ends, at least when it comes to allowing touchdowns. They've allowed 7 touchdowns to opposing tight ends, which is the most in the NFL. They're allowing almost 18 fantasy points per game to tight ends, which is 3rd worst in the NFL. So you heavily have to consider this guy. I think he's obviously a really good cheap option. Now, since I talked about Jimmy Graham earlier in the video, since I've already given out 2 tight ends, figured I would talk about 2 different defenses. First up, we have the New York Jets, and this is going to be the obvious play of the week. I mean, at $3,400, it's not a terrible price to get a defense against the Cleveland Browns, so I'm not really going to say any more than that. I mean, it's the Cleveland Browns. Next up, we have the Seattle Seahawks, and they're at $3,000. Now, they're cheaper than the New York Jets, and I don't care who the Seattle Seahawks defense is going up against. If they're cheaper than the Jets, I'm playing the Seahawks because it's a perfect spot to get them. I mean, yes, they're facing the Saints, but I mean, Drew Brees still makes mistakes, right? He's still going to get sacked a couple times. He still has a really high probability of throwing an interception because they're probably not going to run the ball that well, so they're probably going to have to throw the ball a ton. And we all know about the secondary. I'm curious to see whether Cam Chancellor is going to play or not. I haven't heard whether he will or not, but whether he does or not, this is still a really, really good opportunity to get the Seahawks defense at a very, very discounted price, even though the matchup is somewhat, unfavorable. All right, so that's going to do it for the video. I really appreciate you guys for tuning in. Please leave a like if you did enjoy. Also, really quickly, an update on the NBA video situation. I will be doing 2 NBA videos weekly starting next week, not this week, but next week. I plan to be doing those on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I think. So be sure to subscribe if you want to see more of those. As always, you'll see a sleeper/value picks video on Friday. So be sure to be looking for that. And like I said earlier, thank you for watching, and I hope you guys enjoyed. Later.